He was my friend, and we got along great. We did a lot of laughter.
At 84 years old, Ann-Margret has lived through more Hollywood secrets, scandals, and tragedies than most people could ever imagine. She survived the highs of superstardom, the crushing blows of personal loss, and the silence of questions she refused to answer for decades. But now, with the clarity of age and nothing left to protect except the truth itself, Ann-Margret has finally broken her silence. And what she revealed about Elvis Presley has left even lifelong fans stunned. For over half a century, whispers have followed her. The whispers of a fiery, undeniable connection between her and Elvis, an affair that burned behind the cameras of Viva Las Vegas and lingered long after the world thought it was over. The public saw chemistry on screen. Historians speculated about a romance off it, but Ann-Margret herself rarely said more than a few carefully chosen words. She guarded their story like a sacred secret, smiling politely whenever interviewers pushed, brushing aside rumors with elegance and restraint. That silence was deafening. Fans knew there was more to tell, but Ann never gave them what they wanted. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. She only protected. Protected Elvis's marriage to Priscilla, protected her own reputation, and perhaps most of all, protected the memory of a man she had loved in ways few ever understood. But time has a way of stripping away those old walls. And now, at 84, Ann-Margret has given us a revelation that feels less like a scandal and more like a confession carved from the deepest part of her heart. She admitted what many had suspected, but she did it with a weight, a vulnerability that makes it hit harder than any tabloid headline ever could. She revealed the truth about Elvis Presley, not the icon, not the legend, but the man. She spoke of their connection not as gossip, but as something sacred, something that altered the course of both of their lives forever. It wasn't just another Hollywood fling, she insisted. It was real. It was love. And it was devastating. For years, fans had built their own stories around the two of them. They saw the way Elvis's eyes followed Ann during their musical numbers, how their bodies seemed to move as one on screen, how sparks flew in a way that no director could ever stage. They saw the electricity and assumed. But Ann-Margret's revelation went beyond assumption. She confirmed that what audiences felt wasn't acting. It was truth leaking through the cracks of a performance. The passion wasn't scripted. It was lived. And yet her confession wasn't triumphant. There was no gloating, no pride in finally telling all. Instead, there was sorrow, there was regret, and there was an ache that has clearly lingered across the decades. Because even as she revealed her love for Elvis, she also revealed the pain of knowing it could never last. He was torn between her, between Priscilla, between the crushing expectations of fame and the prison of Colonel Parker's empire. Ann-Margret's words carried the weight of a woman who had once held Elvis Presley close, but always at a cost. Why now? That's the question echoing in the minds of every fan who has read or heard her words. Why, after so many years of silence, did Ann-Margret finally speak? The answer seems to lie in the simple truth that time eventually loosens every grip. Age has a way of clarifying what matters, of reminding us that if a story is not told, it may be lost forever. Ann's silence was once a form of loyalty, but her revelation is a gift to history. And the shock isn't just in what she said, it's in how she said it. For decades, Elvis has been mythologized, turned into a figure so large that even his flaws have been romanticized. But Ann's words cut through that myth. She didn't describe him as a king, she described him as a man who laughed with her, who confided in her, who found in her a reflection of himself. She revealed the Elvis who existed in the shadows, the Elvis who desperately sought freedom from the cage of his fame. The impact of her revelation is seismic. Fans who thought they knew everything about Elvis's personal life are suddenly rethinking his choices, his marriage, and his legacy. Ann-Margret's truth doesn't just confirm rumors, it reshapes the story. It forces us to see Elvis not just as the husband of Priscilla, not just as the king of rock and roll, but as a man divided by love, duty, and destiny. And in Ann's words, you can still hear the echoes of that division. She doesn't speak of betrayal, though she could have. She doesn't speak of scandal, though it would sell. She speaks of love, the kind that lingers even after the man is gone, even after the years have dulled everything else. At 84, she has finally allowed herself to admit what fans have always known in their hearts. Elvis Presley loved Ann-Margret, and she loved him back. But this revelation isn't just about love, it's about the silence that followed it. For decades, Ann-Margret carried this truth alone, keeping it locked away while Elvis's story was rewritten by others. Now, by speaking, she has reclaimed her place in it, not as a rumor, not as a footnote, but as the woman who once held the king's heart. And the question that now hangs heavy in the air is this: what price did she pay for that silence? What scars remain from loving Elvis Presley in secret? And what more might she still be holding back? Because Ann-Margret's confession may have shocked the world, but it also opened a door into the kind of truth that doesn't just change how we see Elvis, it changes how we see her. To understand the weight of Ann-Margret's revelation, we have to go back to where it all began. The year was 1963, and Hollywood was buzzing about a new film that would pair two of the hottest stars of their time: Elvis Presley, already the king of rock and roll, and Ann-Margret, a fiery young actress whose charisma on screen was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. The movie was Viva Las Vegas, and what unfolded behind the cameras would become one of Hollywood's most whispered stories. From the very first rehearsal, the chemistry between them was undeniable. Cast and crew couldn't ignore it. Elvis and Ann moved in rhythm not just when the cameras rolled, but in every stolen glance and every laugh between takes. Elvis was known for turning on the charm, but with Ann-Margret it wasn't an act. She matched his energy, his wit, his hunger for excitement. They were two meteors colliding at full speed, and the sparks could be felt by everyone in the room. Ann-Margret later admitted that they were almost mirror images of each other, both fiercely ambitious, both playful, both craving an intensity that few others could understand. On screen, their chemistry made Viva Las Vegas one of Elvis's most successful films. Off-screen, it was something far more dangerous, a love affair that neither of them could fully control. But this wasn't just another fling. Elvis had many admirers, and Ann had her own share of attention from Hollywood. What set this apart was the depth. Elvis confided in Ann, revealing vulnerabilities he rarely showed to anyone. He shared his frustrations about the movie roles that cheapened his talent, his battles with Colonel Tom Parker's suffocating control, and his longing to be taken seriously again as an artist. Ann listened, not as a fan, but as an equal who truly understood him. She gave him something he rarely found: companionship without judgment. And in turn, Elvis gave her a piece of himself that the world never saw. Their nights together weren't always filled with glamour. Sometimes it was just two young stars talking about dreams, fears, and the weight of fame. Yet hanging over them was the shadow of Priscilla Presley. Elvis was already tied to a life waiting for him back at Graceland. Priscilla was the woman carefully groomed by Parker and Elvis's inner circle to be his queen, and Ann-Margret knew it. The world expected Elvis to marry Priscilla, and Ann was caught in the cruel position of being both the love he couldn't resist and the scandal he couldn't afford. The tension tore at both of them. Elvis tried to balance his loyalty to Priscilla with his passion for Ann. For a time, he convinced himself he could manage both worlds. But love is rarely that simple. Rumors began leaking to the press, and Parker's empire grew nervous. The affair that had once given Elvis life was now threatening to unravel everything. For Ann, the pain was excruciating. She loved Elvis deeply, but she also understood the forces around him, the expectations of his family, the pressure from Parker, and the image he had to maintain. She once described their relationship as a force we couldn't resist, but forces that burn that brightly rarely last forever. Eventually, Elvis drifted back toward the path that had been laid out for him, the one that led to his marriage with Priscilla. Ann was left with memories that haunted her, but also with a truth she refused to betray. She never lashed out publicly, never sought to capitalize on their romance. Instead, she chose silence, preserving the dignity of what they shared even as her own heart bore the scars. And yet, her silence only added to the legend. Fans speculated endlessly. Was she the true love of Elvis's life? Was she the woman he could never quite let go of? Every time Ann and Elvis appeared in public together, even years later, the air seemed to charge with unspoken history. Now, as Anne-Margret finally reveals the truth, it confirms what so many suspected. Theirs was not just a passing attraction. It was a love story, messy, complicated, heartbreaking, and real. A story that shaped them both in ways the world never fully knew. But if their love was so powerful, why did Anne keep silent for so long? What toll did it take on her to bury the truth while the world spun its own version of events? And what did that silence cost her? Personally, emotionally, even spiritually? Those questions linger, and the answers lead us to the next chapter of her story. Decades of secrets, shadows, and the burden of carrying a love she could never fully claim. After Viva Las Vegas faded from theaters, so too did the public story of Elvis and Anne-Margret. Elvis returned to Graceland, bound by his commitment to Priscilla, while Anne carried on with her rising career. But the truth, the love, the heartbreak, the memories didn't vanish. They lingered in the shadows, unspoken yet never forgotten. For Anne-Margret, silence became both a shield and a burden. She chose not to reveal the details of their relationship, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty. She understood what Elvis represented to the world, what his carefully maintained image meant to his fans, to Parker's empire, and to Priscilla. To speak openly would have been to ignite a scandal that could have destroyed him. So she carried the weight quietly, smiling for cameras, answering questions with charm, and dodging the truth with a grace that only deepened the mystery. But silence comes at a cost. Anne often described herself as deeply private, yet those who knew her best could see the moments where memory caught her off guard. In rare interviews, she would let slip a word, a pause, or a look that spoke volumes without naming names. She would refer to a force or a connection without elaborating, leaving fans to fill in the blanks. Her discretion was intentional, but it also revealed the wound she still carried. Elvis, for his part, didn't entirely erase her from his life either. Letters, phone calls, and unspoken signals between them hinted that the connection never fully died, even as he lived out his marriage to Priscilla and the pressures of fame consumed him. There were moments, private and fleeting, where their bond resurfaced, though the public rarely knew. For Anne, each one was a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. When Elvis died in 1977, the world mourned the king of rock and roll. But Anne-Margret's grief was quieter, more personal, and perhaps deeper than most realized. She attended his funeral not as a spectacle, but as a mourner who had lost someone irreplaceable. Those close to her say she was inconsolable, and for good reason. Elvis had not just been a co-star, not just a friend, he had been the great love she was never allowed to keep. And so she chose once again to retreat into silence. For decades after his death, Anne rarely spoke of him. When she did, her words were carefully chosen, drenched in respect, never sensationalized. She refused to reduce their story to cheap gossip, even when tabloids clamored for it. She could have capitalized on it, written a tell-all, or fueled the endless speculation, but she never did. Her silence was not just loyalty, it was love. But that silence was also a shadow that followed her through her life. Anne-Margret went on to marry Roger Smith, a man who stood by her side for 50 years until his death. By all accounts, their marriage was strong, a true partnership. Yet even within that bond, Elvis's ghost lingered. Roger reportedly understood that Elvis had been a part of Anne's life that could never be erased, and he accepted it. That acceptance was a quiet testament to how powerful her connection with Elvis truly was. Professionally, Anne flourished. Movies, television, awards, and acclaim. But no matter how high her career soared, the whispers of her connection to Elvis always followed. Reporters never stopped asking, and fans never stopped wondering. She remained composed, deflecting, protecting, never revealing, and with each passing year, the silence only made the legend grow. But silence does not heal all wounds. Instead, it often deepens them. The decades that Anne-Margret spent keeping their story hidden left her carrying a burden that aged with her. She watched as Elvis's legacy was rewritten again and again by others, managers, biographers, even Hollywood itself. And through it all, she knew that the piece of Elvis she had held closest to her heart was one the world had never seen. Now, with the years behind her and the fear of scandal long past, Anne-Margret has decided to reveal the truth. Not out of bitterness, not to cash in on a story that fans have been desperate to hear, but because time has stripped away the reasons for silence. At 84, her voice carries not the thrill of scandal, but the weight of history. And that is why her confession matters so deeply. Because it doesn't just tell us about Elvis Presley, it tells us about the silence of a woman who loved him enough to protect him, even when it cost her. It tells us about the burden of secrets that linger for a lifetime. And it tells us that even legends like Elvis live on not only in music and memory, but in the hearts of those who dared to love them in the shadows. But if Ann-Margret's silence shaped her life for so many years, what exactly did she finally reveal when she decided to break it? What truth, long buried, has now come to light? And how will it change the way we remember Elvis Presley forever? When Ann-Margret finally spoke, her words carried the weight of 6 decades of silence. They weren't dramatic or self-serving. They weren't laced with bitterness or anger. They were simple, heartfelt, and devastatingly honest. At 84, she finally admitted what so many had long suspected. She and Elvis Presley had shared a love that was as real as it was impossible. Her confession didn't come wrapped in scandal. It came wrapped in truth. She described Elvis not as the king, not as the myth that the world worshipped, but as a man, flawed, tender, passionate, and vulnerable. She revealed that their connection wasn't just chemistry or attraction, it was deeper, something that lived inside them both, something they carried even as life pulled them apart. Anne spoke of Elvis with reverence, remembering the way he confided in her, how he trusted her with fears he couldn't share with anyone else. She said he was a man torn between 2 worlds, the duty he felt to Priscilla and the empire Parker had built around him, and the freedom he found in her company. For Anne, their love was never about stealing him away. It was about cherishing the part of Elvis that only she knew. The most shocking part of her confession was not the confirmation of their affair, it was the emotion in her voice when she described what it cost her. She admitted that letting him go was the hardest choice she ever made, that she had loved him enough to walk away because staying would have destroyed them both. It was not weakness, it was sacrifice. And for the first time, Anne allowed the world to see the pain behind her silence. Fans who heard her words were shaken. For decades, they had argued about her role in Elvis's life. Some called her the other woman. Others believed she was his one true love. But Anne's confession reframed the story entirely. She wasn't a scandal. She wasn't a rival. She was a keeper of his truth, a woman who chose silence over spectacle, loyalty over self-interest. Her revelation also casts new light on Elvis himself. The image of the king has always been one of dominance, charisma, and control. But Anne's truth shows us the man behind the crown, the man who longed for freedom, who ached for authenticity, who found in Anne a mirror of himself. It reminds us that Elvis's greatest battles weren't on stage. They were in his heart. Ann-Margret's confession at 84 is not just about the past, it's about legacy. By finally telling her story, she has forever altered the way we remember Elvis Presley. He is no longer just the husband to Priscilla, no longer just the tragic star who spiraled into addiction and fame's crushing grip. He is also the man who loved Ann-Margret, who shared with her a bond so powerful that even 60 years later, she still speaks of him with tears in her eyes. And what of Anne herself? For too long, her place in Elvis's story was reduced to rumors and speculation. But with her confession, she has reclaimed her voice. She is no longer the silent shadow hovering around his legacy. She is a central figure in his life, one whose silence shaped the myth and whose words now rewrite it. Her decision to speak now carries another layer of meaning. At her age, Anne knows there is little left to lose. But there is something to give. Honesty. By breaking her silence, she gives fans closure. She gives historians truth, and she gives herself the peace of no longer carrying the burden alone. The story of Elvis and Ann-Margret will always be complicated. An affair born in passion, ended in heartbreak, and buried under decades of secrecy. But thanks to her confession, it is also now a story of love. Messy, human, and unforgettable. It is the kind of story that reminds us that behind every legend stands a man, and behind every myth lies a truth waiting to be told. And perhaps that is Ann-Margret's final gift to Elvis. By finally telling the world what they shared, she has given him back his humanity. She has reminded us that Elvis Presley wasn't just a voice, a face, a spectacle. He was a man who loved and was loved in return. And even though he is gone, that truth will live on. Through her words, through her memories, and through the legacy of a love too powerful to stay hidden forever. So what do you think? Was Ann-Margret's confession a long overdue truth that finally honors Elvis's legacy? Or should some secrets have remained buried? Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of love, betrayal, and legacy behind the legends of music history.